that the situation represented in the photograph reappears in its quintessence. The Germans were bent on exterminating the Jews as individuals and on erasing what the star and its inscription represented, the Jew. Thus, from one single snapshot, the viewer gets the intimation of a vast number of interactions between German ideological hallucinations and administrative measures, Dutch institutions and individual choices, Jewish institutions, and at the center of it all, the fate of a Jewish individual. Translated into words, narrated within its context, interpreted at various levels of significance, the photo can be seen as a metonymic illustration of what could be defined as an integrated history of the Holocaust. In this presentation, I shall first address the very notion of an integrated history of the Holocaust, then turn to some narrative and interpretive choices demanded by such an approach, and finally evoke the kind of concrete issues that this form of history may bring up. One, the concept of an integrated history of the Holocaust. The need for this kind of history first became clear to me during the debates of the mid and late 1980s, and particularly as a result of the confrontation with Martin Brochard, at the time the director of the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, regarding his in 1985 article, Plea for the Historicization of National Socialism. One of Brochard's arguments was directed against the traditional representation of the Third Reich as a simplistic black and white rendition that had to give way to various shades of gray. Brochard's barely hidden subtext, which emerged during our exchange of letters at the end of 1987, contended that the Jewish survivors' perception of this past, as well as that of their descendants, albeit, and I quote him, worthy of respect, nonetheless represented a mythical memory, again a quote, that set a, quote, coarsening obstacle on the path of a more rational German historiography, end of quote. Let me explain that. There were huge historical debates about the Holocaust in Germany in the mid-80s, what's called the historians' controversy. And within this, and out of this, came a very specific issue came up about the historicization of National Socialism, which really meant in many ways the historicization of Nazi atrocities. That is, putting them back in the normal interpretations of history and not setting a kind of black and white picture. And the major instigator and proponent of this attitude, which is reasonable in many ways, was Martin Brochard. And he wrote an article, as I mentioned, a plea for the historicization of National Socialism, saying more or less enough with this black and white picture, which was used in the Nuremberg trials and so on. Now we have to get back to a very complex history, and he spoke a lot. He wrote and edited many volumes of everyday life in Nazi Germany, which of course showed the normality under the horror, in a way, focusing more on the normality. I answered by writing an article called Reflections on the Historicization of National Socialism, which angered him. And he suggested that we exchange letters, which would be published, of course, in a journal, well-known journal of German history, and that we do it fast. He thought, of course, that I would lose my grip in a way in a very fast exchange of these letters. And in the first letter he made, which he wrote to me, he made a mistake at the end. I think it was a mistake. You will leave it to you, saying that we, the Jews, actually were so involved in these events that he didn't say it in these words, but that we couldn't write an objective history of the Third Reich. What he said was that there was a mythical memory of the victims and of their descendants. That is, in a way, a Jew could not write an objective history of the events. And their mythical memory, as I read out, even though worthy of respect, was an obstacle in the course of a rational historiography. So not only couldn't we write this history, but in a way, by holding to our mythical perception of the past, we were in a way impeding a much more, a historicization of the events, if you wish. Which led me to answer, and that I don't mention in the lecture, but mention it in the explanation, that yes, we were burdened by this past, and each of us had a subjective approach to it, coming from, yes, from what happened to the Jews. But didn't he think that being in the Hitler Youth as he had been, and what I didn't know at the time but came out after his death, and being a member of the Nazi Party, was not as heavy a burden on writing an objective history as having been a victim of the events? Of course, that changed in a way the balance of the debate, because how can you speak of objectivity if you have gone through the socialization of the Nazi Party in being a member of the Hitler Youth, and so on and so forth. So that this renewed the debate in a way, but it also convinced me that I had, at least as well as I could, of course, write a history of these events by reintroducing, by not only presenting the events as I saw them, that is from the perspective from what I knew about the history, let's call it, of the perpetrators, of the surrounding world, and I knew quite a lot about the churches and so on, but also mainly introducing Jewish history. That is, the Jewish dimension into that history. Because, and now I'm explaining instead of reading, what happened over the years is not only that somebody like Brochat, and a lot with him, of course, he represented a whole trend of thinking. We're saying, well, the victims, you know, they are, in German you would say, schwer belastet, very heavily burdened, and what they present as history is really somewhat mythical. But the fact is that even among Jewish historians, there were doubts about using the testimonies, the sources coming from the victims in the writing of this history. We have lost a few weeks ago a great historian of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, who passed in August sometime, I think. And Raoul was a good friend, although we went in different directions in our interpretation. Himself did not think that Jewish sources could be used in this history. He was for using exclusively almost German sources, German documents, the documents of the perpetrators, and considered Jewish documents as not, of the time, right, as not being sources which one could rely upon. I will immediately answer that in the continuation of the lecture. So it was not only, there was an exclusion, I would say, of the Jewish side of this history, which led to something which most of you know, the students as well as others. That is, when you come to speak of the Holocaust, you say this and this was decided, and so many Jews were deported to Treblinka, and so many were deported to Belzec, and so many were deported into to Auschwitz, let's say, and 13,000 were killed here, and 28,000 were killed there. That is, it becomes statistic. It becomes the victims, in a way, become absolutely and perceived as individuals, as group, as notwithstanding the fact that in Israel, for example, there is a very active history of the Holocaust from the Jewish side being written on, let's say, the ghetto of Benjin or on Bialystok, the Jews of Bialystok during the event, and so on. But it's written in Hebrew very often, so that it is not integrated into the European, American historiography, and it is very often focused on specifics which would not change the balance. So you understand what I mean by an integrated history of the Holocaust. My idea, in response to these debates with Brochard, but also in response to what I saw as I was teaching in Israel and doing my work there, was that one had really to bring all this together. It's a simple idea, but one that demands, as I will explain later, creates some problems, but also raises questions which maybe would be unseen otherwise. Now, again, I will get over some things that are explained here at some length. And if we look now at this integrated history and look at the side now of the perpetrator and the surrounding world, I will come to the victims in a moment. There is one point which has to be stressed and which we did not know as well as we do know it now, even a few years ago. The knowledge about what was happening to the Jews was very widespread very early. I mean, usually, and Brochard in his correspondence with me said, well, at the end of the war or towards the last year of the war, of course, this became known, but you know, one cannot read history backwards. Most of the Germans did not know anything until 1943, 44. It's not true. In 42, many people were very well informed, both among, let's call it the perpetrators. These are terms which I don't like very much, but those active in the killings, of course they knew, but also in the populations around and in the churches, in the wider European field. I mean, people very quickly grasped what was going on. The victims did not know. And that is one of those very strange things which come up now in research. That is, we have now several books in German, but they will be in English very soon, Longerich, and Dito Paul and Bayor and others, which show that knowledge was very widespread from at the latest mid-1942 on, but actually the killings on Russian territory, on Soviet territory, were known immediately. Soldiers were writing letters home. There were millions of soldiers, and they were writing letters. They were describing, I will quote a few of them. So that in the rear, in a way, you got postcards, letters, you got snapshots, everything possible, which indicated major massacres, and then the idea of total extermination spread in the population. We now have, as I will possibly mention, also the reports of the secret police, the Nazi secret police, the SD reports, the Sicherheitsdienst reports, which have been collected regarding the Jewish question in a very interesting volume. I mean, it's just a volume of reports by two historians, Kulka and Jekyll. And on a CD-ROM, you have tens of thousands of those reports. And they show that the population was discussing, in Germany at least, what was happening to the Jews. So the very knowledge gives a totally different picture of the non-participation, if you wish. Of course, non-participation or indifference or whatever, apathy, but knowing what was going on. And that introduces quite a new element into our perception of this. Again, not the victims. I will try to explain why in a moment. And let me now go a little bit into the details of that knowledge. The Polish underground was openly referring to the mass murder of the Jews as soon as it started. The Swiss federal authorities, including the police, explicitly evoked the consequences of the hermetic closing of borders for Jews in midsummer 1942. In Germany itself, the fate of the Jews was quite openly alluded to at various levels of the population. And I quote now a letter. In Bereza Kartushka, where I stopped for lunch, Wehrmacht Private H.K. wrote home on June 18, 1942, 13,000 Jews had just been shot on the previous day. Men, women, children had to undress completely and were then liquidated with a shot in the back of the neck. The clothes were disinfected and used again. I am convinced that if the war goes on much longer, the Jews will be turned into sausage and served to Russian war prisoners and to Jewish specialized workers. End of quote. A few months later, Private SM, the names are not given for privacy reasons, for the families and so on his way to the front, wrote from the town of Auschwitz, He just was passing through the town. The Jews arrive here, that is to Auschwitz, at a weekly rate of 7,000 to 8,000. Shortly thereafter, they die a hero's death, in German Heldentod, which is sarcastic, of course. And he added, it's really good to see the world. In Minden, Westphalia, which is very much to the west of Germany, the inhabitants had been discussing the fate of deportees from their own town as early as December 1941. The deportations from Germany started in October 1941. The final solution at its full scale started in early 42. And these inhabitants publicly mentioned that Jews who were unable to work were shot. A few weeks later, in February 42, Bishop Berning of Osnabrück noted that admittedly there was a plan to exterminate all the Jews. That is, he had heard that 2-3 weeks after the notorious Wannsee conference, where the organization of the final solution had been discussed in Berlin. Whereas here and there, small groups of individuals risked their lives in trying to help the hounded victims, no social segment or institutions, the churches, peasantry, business world, etc., intervened in Germany. In Europe, there were some exceptions, Denmark, Italy to a point, Bulgaria to a point, but that is that. Let us turn to the Jewish dimension of this history. Even when referred to within the essentially non-Jewish centered historiography, it tends to deal mainly with institutional collective Jewish behavior, i.e. with the decisions of the Jewish leadership groups, the councils, or some of the best-known attempts at resistance, the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, for example. But in fact, the main contribution to our knowledge at a collective level, bolstered by any number of individual testimonies, applies to a much wider and fundamental point. In contradistinction to vast segments of surrounding society, the victims did not know what was ultimately in store for them. In Germany and in the West, the information available to the Jews had somehow not been pieced together. In the East, the Jewish populations in the immense majority refused to believe what they saw. This in turn decisively contributed to the smoothness of the extermination process and to the so-called passivity of the victims. Expecting terrible hardship and even widespread death is one thing. Expecting immediate murder, quite another in terms of reactions. Now, you may ask, you should ask, how comes? If everybody knew, how comes that? Well, there is one metaphor which comes to mind. It's not a very good one, but take it for whatever it's worth. some of us, many, I guess, have encountered terminal patients and visited them in the last moments. And you will have noticed that very often the terminally ill people say, well, I will not, that won't take long. And then start speaking of the future and of plans for next year and so on. That is, when you are the target, the resistance or defense against acknowledging that you are here to be murdered within weeks or months is such that you say it and then you say the contrary. You have it in diaries all the time. That is, you have the perception in Jewish diaries that death is imminent and that the transport to the east means systematic murder, and then people speak, the same people in the same entry sometimes, what they will do after the war. So that the victims, there have been many explanations for that, but there is a kind of refusal to internalize something that met the eye, to put it simply. Now, this is one aspect. That is, if you wonder why the whole process was so smooth, sure, it has to do with German organization, with the modernity of transportation and so on in our age, of course. But it has also to do with the lack of belief of the victims in what was in store for them. And therefore, I don't say they would have resisted, but they could have created chaos in many ways. And by believing that they could gain time and maybe even escape, kept them passive. Of course, it kept them passive, and we all would have done the same. That is, not only the fear that the family and everybody else around would be taken as hostage and killed on the spot if you did something, but also the fact that by trying to be very passive, you could really get through the whole thing, which was an illusion, but you couldn't believe that this was an illusion, explains the smoothness of the process, much more maybe than some of the organizational aspects. Now, the Jewish aspect of this history can also be looked, and I tried really to look at it, from the viewpoint of the individual, that is the individual person, the individual voice, if you wish. Any effort taken by individual Jews or small groups in order to hamper the Nazi effort, bribing officials, policemen, or denunciators, paying families in order to hide children or adults, fleeing to woods or mountains, disappearing to small villages or into large cities, converting, joining resistance movements, stealing food, anything that came to mind and led to survival, all these actions represented obstacles, be they minimal, on the Nazi path. It is also possibly mainly at this micro level that Jewish interaction with the forces acting in the implementation of the final solution needs to be studied further and integrated into the wider domains of this history. The history of the destruction of European Jewry at the level of individuals can be reconstructed, and here I disagree with Hilberg, of course, from the perspective of the victims on the basis of post-war depositions, interviews and memoirs, but mainly owing to the unusually large number of diaries and letters written during the events and recovered over the following decades. These diaries and letters were written by Jews of all countries, all walks of life, all age groups, either living under direct German domination or within the wider sphere of persecution. Of course, the diaries have to be used with the same critical attention as any other document. Yet as a source for the history of Jewish life during the years of persecution and extermination, they remain crucial and irreplaceable. Thousands of witnesses confided their observations to the secrecy of their private writings. major events and much of daily incidents, attitudes and reactions of the surrounding world, which these chroniclers recorded, merged into an increasingly comprehensive, albeit at times contradictory picture. By the way, the contradictions in the diaries are a sign very often of their authenticity. If the diaries or the diaries survived the war, there is a danger that some of the contradictions were effaced to give a more coherent aspect to the diary, or things were taken out which were unpleasant, like in the diary of Anne Frank. As you know, the first editions were sanitized by the father who survived. Now we have, of course, the full diary. But it's very easy to see, and contradictions are one of the proofs that the diary is authentic and hadn't been touched. Very often one found the manuscript in ditches and so on, or in apartments from which everybody was deported. So in those cases there is really no major problem. The immensity of the diaries. Now, it gives us diaries and letters describe in great detail the initiatives and daily brutality of the perpetrators, the reactions of populations, the life and destruction of their own communities, but they also record their own everyday world, that of despair, rumors, illusions, and hope, in constant succession, mostly to the end. And now I quote, "My dear little daddy, bad news. After my aunt, it's my turn to leave." Thus began the hastily pencil-written card sent on February 12, 1943, from Drancy, French camp, by 17-year-old Louise Jacobson to her father, who still lived in Paris. And the letter goes on. "I'm in excellent spirits, as everybody else. You should not worry, Daddy. First, I'm living in very good shape. This last week, I have eaten very, very well. I got 2 packages by proxy, one from a friend who was just deported, the other from my aunt, who was also just deported." That shows that she didn't know, of course, what all this meant. "Now, your package arrived exactly at the right moment. We leave tomorrow morning. I am with my friends, as many are leaving. I entrusted my watch and all my other belongings to decent people from my room. My daddy, I kiss you 100,000 times with all my strength. Courage et à bientôt, your daughter Louise." On February 13, 1943, Louise left for Auschwitz in transport number 48 with 1,000 other French Jews. A surviving female friend, a chemical engineer, went through the selection with her. "Tell them that you are a chemist," Irma had whispered. When her turn arrived and she was asked about her profession, Louise declared, "Student." She was sent to the left to the gas chamber. Such personal chronicles, such individual Jewish voices, are also the most immediate testimonies about dimensions of ongoing events usually unperceived in other sources. Like flashes that illuminate parts of a landscape, they confirm intuitions, they warn us against easy generalizations, they tear through the smugness of scholarly detachment. Mostly they just repeat the known, but express it with unmatched forcefulness, thus reminiscing about the murder of some 12,000 Jews in Stanislavov in Galicia. On October 12, 1941, a young female diarist, Elsa Binder, brought up the fate of her 2 friends, Tamarchik and Esterka. These are diminutives of fondness. Tamarchik is Tamar, of course. Esterka is Esther. "I hope," Elsa wrote in her diary, "that death was kind to Tamarchik and took her right away, and that she didn't have to suffer like her companion Esterka, who was seen being strangled." Finally, simultaneous representation adds an essential dimension to the historical perception of the Holocaust. It need not be solely transnational, that is, comparison from country to country. It can apply to several categories of events usually not linked to one another, occurring at the same time in the same country. That is, this general panorama allows you to compare, but it need not be comparison between what happened in Belgium, in Holland, in France, but it can also compare different aspects of what happened in Germany itself, but from very different angles, which are usually not brought together in the histories we have. Just in late 1941, the decision to exterminate all the Jews of Europe had been taken, probably. We don't know if it's October or December, but at that time of 41. At the same time, and that's the point, the main representative institution of the German Evangelical Church, the Church Chancellery, responding to a violently anti-Semitic stance taken by a number of local churches adhering to the German Christian line, Deutsche Christen, which was an extreme pro-Nazi group within the Evangelical Church, issued a statement, that is the main line, the Chancellery, issued a statement of its own denying any solidarity with converted Jews. You see, here is the main institution of the evangelical churches. You have the German Christians on one side, they are Nazis. You have the confessing church, to which I will come, on the other side, and the mainstream is now represented by this chancellery, and it declares, as you will see, no solidarity with converted Jews, not with the Jews as such, but those who are Protestants, sometimes old-time Protestant, let's say. This was made brutally clear in a circular letter published on December 23 by the Chancellery's Deputy Director, Günther Fürling. And I quote him, "The breakthrough of racial consciousness in our people, intensified by the experience of the war and the corresponding measures taken by the political leadership, has brought about the elimination of the Jews from the community of us Germans. This is an incontestable fact, which the German evangelical churches, which serve the one eternal gospel within the German people and live within the legal domain of these people as corporations under public law, cannot heedlessly ignore. Therefore, in agreement with the spiritual council of the German evangelical church, we request the highest authorities to take suitable measures so that baptized non-Aryans remain separate from the ecclesiastical life of the German congregations. The baptized non-Aryans will have to find the ways and means to create their own facilities to serve their particular worship and pastoral needs. We will make every effort to help obtain permission for such facilities from the responsible authorities." Nobody was fooled, of course, by the last sentence of the Chancellery's statement. The confessing church, that is the opposition in a way, protested, but its protest was that of a minority and did not call for any countermeasures. A few weeks earlier, several Catholic bishops, led by Bishop Preising of Berlin, circulated a text meant to express support for converted Jews sent to the East, that is, to deportation. The majority of the bishops' conference, led by Cardinal Bertram, rejected any such motion, even in its most timid phrasing. Of course, neither Protestants nor Catholics addressed the fate of the non-converted Jews, 99%. In other words, as the deportation from Germany started, and mainly as the first extermination sites were activated or built, Hitler and his acolytes, that is the point, could rely on the passivity of the only counterforce that at once challenged the regime about its criminal policies. That is, the churches, the Catholic Church mainly, Bishop Gallen of Münster rose in the cathedral on August 4th or something, 1941, and denounced the killing of the mentally ill and said he would sue the party, he would sue, this was criminal, and the question he rose was what will happen to soldiers coming back maimed and unable to work and so on, and will they be also killed? So that and nothing happened to Bishop Gallen. Hitler decided not to deal with the churches during that part of the war, but to wait for after the war. And that is the only counterforce that ever dared challenge the regime on its crimes. But here, at the moment where the decision to exterminate the Jews is taken, the churches in a way declare, because this was an official declaration, that we don't want to have anything to do even with the converted Jews. So of course we have nothing to do with the non-converted Jews, that is the immense majority. The simultaneity of the decision to murder all the Jews of Europe and the declared non-intervention of the Christian churches regarding converted Jews sets the early phase of the final solution in its wider German context. The same context takes on an additional tragically ironic meaning as at the very same time, in the last days of 1941, in the Reich and all over occupied Europe, Jews were celebrating their oncoming liberation in view of the Soviet successes in front of Moscow. You should know, those who do not know this history well, that in the winter of 41, December, actually the Germans were stopped in front of Moscow, and there was a Soviet counterattack. So everywhere the Jews said, liberation is coming, and they rose their glasses, whatever they drank, on the night of the 31st of December to 1st of January 42, in view of the coming liberation. Only in Vilna and somewhat later in Warsaw did a tiny group become aware that the overall extermination was just starting. Now, the second point was narration and interpretation. I will leave it aside. It's somewhat technical. I just want to explain the problem. It's easy to speak about integrated history, and you see that it demands a lot of elements, not only, let us say, within Germany, but with each of the countries involved in this history. That is from Norway, let us say, to Greece, and from northern Russia to Italy, and so on and so forth. It also involves, of course, not only the Germans and the churches and the populations, but also the Jews, as I tried to show. And it creates for the historian a problem, a very simple problem. How do you write it without the reader getting completely confused? That is, how do you keep a narrative with some coherence? And that I will leave for another time, but in a sense, to make it clear, there is one method which will illustrate it for you, and that is film, of course. The cuts and the moving to totally different angles is a filmic method of editing film. And it's not used by historians usually, who are very intent on conceptualization, but as some critics in a good sense, reviewers of the second volume said, I tried all the conceptualizations. I mentioned them in the introduction. They fail. It seems always to be not in a way to grasp the whole situation. So I return in a way to these methods of narration and chronicling almost, after having gone over the conceptualization that exists up to now and seen that it did not help. So just remember that there is a problem here in writing this history, which was a serious problem for me, and almost completely put an end to my efforts. It's true that one can explain specific elements, sequences are very easily explained, but an overall concept, except staying at the most general level, is very difficult to find, or has not been really found. And in this debate, there is a point again which I want to stress, and I will read it out but explain it beforehand. In order, in any case, to write this integrated history, I had to, but I didn't do it for narration purposes. I did it because I believed that this was right. You have to decide whether the final solution, that is the intention of exterminating the Jews of Europe was at the center of the Nazi view of the world and their view of the war. In my opinion, it was, which gives a kind of centrality to all the elements you bring from all sides. But there are many historians, particularly in Germany today, who don't believe that this was central, but have argued that other policies, many policies, were actually involved, and that the extermination of the Jews was a side effect, in a way, of those policies and not central to them. So let me go over this last point quickly. I mean, one of the arguments was Hitler wanted to rob the Jews in order to transfer whatever assets or belongings or clothes or furniture they had to the folk, in order to keep the Germans quiet as the war was getting worse and worse. Those who were bombed out, got furniture, got even homes from Jews that had been deported. The question is, of course, if that was the aim, why not put Jews deported to be slave laborers? Why kill them? If you take everything from them and give it over to the folk, why actually kill them on top of it? But this idea of this being really robbery, and that was the real intention, in order to keep the population in a relatively good mood during those hard times, has been brought up by a very well-known and very good German historian, Götz Ali, in a recent book called Hitler's Volksstaat, which those of you who read German should read. It has been also, of course, criticized. Now, it doesn't, those different views do not answer some very simple questions. Why, as I said, did Hitler decide to exterminate the Jews after robbing them of all their assets? Why did the Nazi leader personally decide in the fall of 1943 to forge ahead with the deportation of the Jews of Denmark and those of Rome, notwithstanding the serious risks involved, the possibility of unrest in Denmark and that of the Pope's public protest, and the non-existent benefits of both operations? The Jews of Rome were very poor. That is, taking the assets of the Jews of Rome didn't add an iota to the wealth of the German community. Why did Himmler, the chief of the police and the SS, reject the Wehrmacht's repeated requests, the army's repeated requests, to keep specialized Jewish workers from extermination? He threatened those who demanded it with dire consequences if they went on demanding to keep Jewish specialized workers. Why, if the decision was not to kill everybody? The secondary function attributed to the anti-Jewish policies, that is what I explained before, cannot easily address apparently marginal yet telling occurrences such as the Reichsführer SS personal demand from Finland's prime minister to have his country deliver its 30 to 40 foreign Jews into German hands, the deportation of the small and impoverished Sephardic Jewish communities from the Aegean Islands, that is in the Mediterranean, in July 1944, that is 8 months before the end of the war, or finally the roundup and deportation of hundreds of Jewish children from France to Auschwitz a few days before the liberation of Paris. I think it was 2 or 3 days before the Allies occupied Paris, liberated Paris. The last transport to Auschwitz with children mainly left Gare de l'Est or Gare de Lyon to carry their freight to their death. So if it was not a policy that was going over all considerations to the very end, how would you explain this kind of decisions? They made no sense in any rationality, in any instrumental rationality. The only approach that seems possible in the writing of an integrated history of the Holocaust, of course, that gives centrality, has to set the Jewish issue at the very center of the regime's worldview and policies. And now I quote an interesting quote from Goebbels, the propaganda minister. the man who really organized the whole propaganda of the Third Reich. All in all, Goebbels noted after a long conversation with Hitler at the end of April 1944, a long-term policy in this war is only possible if one considers it from the standpoint of the Jewish question. This crazed obsession was enthusiastically supported and implemented by Hitler's closest acolytes, by party and state agencies, by officials and technocrats at all levels of the system, and by important segments of the population. The logic, in quote, behind this anti-Jewish passion was constantly spewed by the regime's propaganda. In fact, as Jeffrey Herf has shown, propaganda molded an increasingly ominous image of the Jew, you remember the sign, as the lethal and relentlessly active enemy of the Reich, intent on its destruction. Thus, within the same hallucinatory logic, once the Reich had to fight on both fronts, east and west, without the hope of a rapid victory, and with some early intimations of defeat, end of 41, the United States entered the war and the Russians counterattack, Hitler opted for immediate extermination. Otherwise, as he saw it, the Jews, like in 1917-18, World War I, would destroy Germany and the new Europe from within. And after the military situation became ominous, after Stalingrad mainly, the extermination was accelerated to its utter limits. Now I come to the last and very short part, questions answerable and unanswerable. An integrated history leads in and of itself to comparative queries, as I showed a little bit, and more generally to connections otherwise but dimly perceived. That is, it allows to see things you cannot see if you concentrate on one aspect only. A prime example, and here I am really sorry to read out this example, but you will take it as it comes, could be the glaring lack of an overall Jewish solidarity in the face of catastrophe. The German Jewish leadership attempted to bar endangered Polish Jews from emigrating from the Reich to Palestine in late 1939 and early 1940 in order to keep all emigration openings for German Jews only. Native French Jewish leadership, the Consistoire, ceaselessly demanded from the Vichy government a clear-cut distinction between the status and treatment of native Jews, French that is, and that of foreign ones. The councils in Poland, particularly in Warsaw, were allowing a whole array of privileges to members of the local middle class who could afford paying bribes, while the poor, the refugees from the provinces, and the mass of those devoid of any influence were increasingly pushed into slave labor or driven to starvation and death. Once the deportation started, Polish Jews in Lodz, for example, turned against the deportees from the West. In Westerbork, that's in Holland, German Jews, the elite of the camp, closely working with the German commandants, protected their own and put Dutch Jews on the departure lists, while previously the Dutch Jewish elite had felt secure and was convinced that only refugees, mainly German Jews, would be sent to the local camps, then deported. The hatred of Christian Jews by their Jewish brethren, Christian Jews, that is, Jews who had converted, and vice versa, particularly in the Warsaw Ghetto, is notorious. It should be mentioned, however, that notwithstanding all tensions, widespread welfare efforts, education and cultural activities were open to all in many Jewish communities. Moreover, a strengthening of bonds appeared within small groups sharing a specific political or religious background. Such was typically the case in political youth groups in the ghettos, among Jewish scouts in France, and of course among this or that group of Orthodox Jews. In looking at the big picture, we may reach the conclusion that in a majority of cases, specific ethnic, cultural, political, or religious bonds shared by any number of subgroups took precedence over any feeling of shared Jewishness, which is extraordinarily ironic. While the Nazis were depicting this Jewish world solidarity in order to dominate the world, the Jews the Polish Jews tried to push the German Jews away, and the German Jews, the Polish, and so on and so forth. That is, there was not the least sign of a kind of overall sense we are all together in this boat, of course. They were, but each one trying to save the small group. The Communist Party was very good at it. Jewish communists were really holding together in the camps as well. And other group, Orthodox Jews, but from one group, let's say the Lubavitcher, were holding together, and the Satmarer were holding together but not helping each other, and so on. So you see this kind of subgroup solidarity against a wider sense of solidarity. The comparisons that belong to the very essence of an integrated history may also raise questions that do not allow for any clear answer. Thus, on June 27, 1945, the world-renowned Austrian Jewish chemist Lise Meitner, who in 1939 had emigrated from Germany to Sweden, wrote to her former colleague and friend Otto Hahn, who had continued to work in the Reich. After mentioning that he and the scientific community in Germany knew much about the worsening persecution of the Jews, Meitner went on, and I quote her, "All of you have worked for Nazi Germany and never tried even passive resistance. Certainly, to assuage your conscience, here and there you helped some person in need of assistance, but you allowed the murder of millions of innocent people, and no protest was heard." Meitner's cri de coeur addressed through Hahn to Germany's most prominent scientists, none of them active party members, none of them involved in criminal activities, could have applied as well to the entire intellectual and spiritual elite of the Reich, with some exceptions, of course, and to wide segments of the elites in occupied or satellite Europe. An even more unsettling aspect of the same question arises in regard to the attitude of the Christian churches. In Germany, again with the exception of a few individuals, none of whom belong to the higher reaches of the evangelical or Catholic Church, none of them at the level of bishop or cardinal and so on. No Protestant bishop or Catholic prelate protested publicly against the extermination of the Jews, publicly. When men of goodwill, such as Bishop Preising of Berlin, or the voice of the confessing church, the Württemberg Bishop Theophil Wurm, were ordered to stop their attempts at confidential protest, they submitted. My point is that some did write letters to Hitler even, saying this is bad for the reputation of Germany. Very careful letters. When they got a response, not from Hitler, but from his secretary, stop this kind of correspondence or you will see the consequences, they stopped. No martyrs there. And if we take into account that generally speaking, the German situation was replicated in most occupied European countries, except for Denmark, partly Italy, partly Bulgaria, and for limited protests in Holland and among a few French bishops, some of whom then recanted, the question gets its full significance. That an important number of personalities belonging to Europe's intellectual or spiritual elites did not take a public stand against the murder of the Jews is easily understood. Fear, whatever. I mean, this is the normal human reaction. That in the major countries of deportation and extermination, even a few prominent voices were not publicly heard is puzzling. That not a single personality of major stature was ready to speak out, publicly of course, remains, as some of the other aspects of this history, a continuous source of disbelief. Thank you very much. Should there be... Yes, well, whatever you decide, you know, it's, these are special circumstances today. Yeah, sure.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful But there is another question, and I think it's the question that is more hotly debated among these sort of central Holocaust historians. And this is not whether Hitler was robbing the Jews, but whether extermination was the goal from the beginning. And there the question is, as you know, about the summer, July, August 1941, when we still see leading functionaries debating the possibility of Siberia, later in Ukraine, where working in Lithuania are not killing women and children until what comes massacre. So there's an argument that says, as you know, that that's what I would actually like you to
yes.
like that's the part of it.
Yes. What Hitler thought, nobody knows, of course. But we know what he said at some moment. Now, interestingly, there is a saying of his that has not been very much quoted, except a student of mine, if I may say, Philippe Burin, a quite well-known Swiss historian of these events, who noted that Hitler in 1935, after the Nuremberg laws, said to Walter Gross, who was the head of the racial policy section of the Nazi Party, he said the next steps about the Jews after the Nuremberg racial discrimination laws, I mean racial separation laws, will be emigration, economic spoliation, whatever. And he went on with measures of that kind, which we know very well. And then he said, in case of a war on both fronts, that is a total war, like 1914, 1918, I am ready to the utmost consequence. Nobody knows what that meant, but strangely he came back many years later to the same formula. Now, there was no plan to exterminate the Jews even when the war started. From what we know, there may have been, again, in Hitler's mind, the idea that when the time comes, if there is no quick victory, the Jews will, responsible for the war, in his mind, will be exterminated. But, of course, he said it in a speech on January 20, 1939, but that was before the war. He declared publicly in the Reichstag, if the Jews again drag the humanity into another world war, not the Aryan peoples will be killed, but the Jews will be exterminated. It was meant actually to frighten the Jews behind Roosevelt, behind Churchill, and so on. But some people took it, some historians way back took it seriously as indicating already an intention. I think this is wrong. When the war started, one sees it from all kinds of signs. Emigration was still possible. Jews were pushed beyond the borders of the German occupation line in Poland into the Soviet zone. Of course, if you wanted to exterminate them, you wouldn't allow them. The RSHA helped Jews to organize illegal immigration to Palestine, what is sometimes forgotten until beginning of 41. The main idea was to concentrate the Jews in a territorial area, like the Indian, it was also an example taken, Indian reserve areas in this country. And Lublin was chosen first, then after the victory over France, Madagascar, an island in the Indian Ocean. Now, this was not to create a Jewish state there. This was under the supervision of the German police. That was the formula, which meant they would die. One way or the other, they would die there, but it was not immediate extermination. Then when Madagascar became a pipe dream because, of course, the British were fighting on and you couldn't transport millions of Jews to Madagascar, the idea of northern Russia, which you mentioned, became the territorial plan. The Jews of Europe, after victory over Russia, which was expected within 3 or 4 months of the beginning of the attack, that is for October 41, more or less, the attack being June 22nd, 41, the Jews would all be transported to northern Russia, and there again, under harsh climate, as was said, they would be taken care of. That is, they would perish. But all this didn't happen. That is, the Russians were not beaten, on the contrary, and the United States entered the war, and Hitler always believed the Jews were behind Roosevelt, behind Stalin. So here was now the war on both fronts. East, the Soviets; west, the Anglo-Saxons. And he must have understood, because although, again, he believed in victory in 42, 43, but still he must have understood that the war would be prolonged, that Germany would suffer immense casualties, and that possibly the war would be lost. As he had sworn that never again would Germany surrender like in 1718, he had at least to liquidate the internal enemy. Now, who was the internal enemy? Internal and external, the Jews. Those who were really trying to destroy Germany and the new Europe from the inside, but also organize the coalition from the outside. In his obsession, the Jews were the enemy. That's why Goebbels says, after speaking to the Führer, he says, one cannot understand the history of this epoch without looking at it from the angle of the Jewish question or the war. And the moment this obsessional kind of idea took hold of him, he didn't give a written order, of course, but sometime in October or December, or between October and December, there are many indications about December, in my opinion. 41, the order must have been given, a hint or whatever, you can start. And we have now a document which we didn't have, let's say, 6, 7 years ago, found in the German archives in the Soviet Union. You know that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, we, the historians, had access to an immense trove of German documents which the Soviets had kept for themselves for various reasons, hadn't shared, and that gave us a lot of new insights. And the document is the following. What was found was a kind of diary kept by Himmler, that is the head of the SS, a work diary that is a chronicle of whom he met every day, and what was in shorthand the topic discussed, so that you can reconstruct the activity for over 2 years. And on December 17th, 1941, that is a few days after Germany declared war on the United States, knowing, of course, that war would be a matter of days with the United States after Pearl Harbor, Himmler writes in his diary, Führer, which means meeting with Hitler, colon, Jewish question, that was the topic, slash, we do not know what that slash meant, but probably just a sign, Ausrotten als Partisanen, Ausrottung als Partisanen, that is exterminate or annihilate as partisans, that is people fighting behind your own lines, which means not the partisan fighting in Soviet territory that everybody knew they were being killed, but really within our own domain. I mean, they are the enemy within. I think Ausrotten als Partisanen is really and that was Himmler's own handwriting in his working agenda. Does that answer your question? Now, on Soviet territory, yeah. You mean 600,000 by then? Yes.
So, I guess the counter argument would be if at that moment that you have this document in those deeds, there is already such a scale of killing that the counter-argument is that people feel that this scale of killing has already started, so that it's not just a matter of an order coming from above, it's a matter of things coming from below.
Yeah. Well, the answer to this, I mean, these are very classic issues, but important ones. If you look at the growth of the murder campaign, indeed, at the beginning of the attack on the Soviet Union, Jewish men were killed. Heydrich even gives categories: men in official positions, members of the Communist Party, commissars, of course, and so on. Then the killing starts to widen to larger categories of Jews, and in August, more or less, within the month of August, you have the killing of women and children. Now, there is an explanation to that as well. Unfortunately, it is simple. Women, Stalin gave the order to start partisan warfare on Soviet territory. Hitler mentioned that on 16th of July in a conference about the situation and said that's very good. That allows us now to kill anybody who looks even, who doesn't look straight at us. That is, it will allow us to take any measure. Now, this meant killing Jewish men is obvious. Killing Jewish women became an idea which spread. They could be transmitting information from one group to the other of partisans, or creating any trouble behind the German lines. Killing the children was necessary because who would take care of the small children if the men and the women were killed? And this you see in several incidents where the explanation is given. What do we do with those children? Kill them immediately, because who will, if we have to kill the father and the mother, so why keep the children, of course? So that the spreading on Soviet territory, it becomes general. Yet you do not see in any document any allusion to deportations from France, from Norway, from Saloniki, from wherever, which was already occupied. And it is really in December, from October to December, that suddenly there is a lot of references to potential deportations and to the killing of European Jews in general. So in looking at the violence, you are right, it spreads, and there is a kind of continuity, which may also have been fostered from the basis. But as Hilberg himself said in a conference in Stuttgart in '83, and he certainly was not a great believer in the role of Hitler, it needed an order to get over a certain cross. There was a line that had to be crossed, and there you couldn't do it, given the structure of the Third Reich, without the order coming from the top. That would be there. Should I recognize the... Yes.
First of all, Professor, I enjoyed your speech. Very insightful. You said some things that I've never heard before. My question, I'd like to focus on something that you talked about at the end, which I thought was very intriguing. You talked how different types of Jews didn't have any uniformity, as if the leadership for all the Jews was non-existent.
Right.
Throughout all of Germany.
And beyond.
Right. So my question is, how on earth could it have been, number one? And number two,
how on earth?
How could the leadership of the Jews notify the Jews that were being taken, that the catastrophe was about? That's really what I'd like to know. I don't see, under the circumstances,
what could have helped? You are absolutely right, except that what I was trying to say was that in the face of growing persecution after the beginning of the war, we see that the German, the Reichsvereinigung was the German Jewish Council, let's call it that way, did everything. There were possibilities for groups of young Polish Jews living in Germany and threatened with deportation to concentration camps. At that time, Polish Jews living in Germany were really pushed over into Poland or put into concentration camps. We speak now after the beginning of the war. They were sent to Sachsenhausen, where they died very quickly. The secretary of the Reichsvereinigung, a man called Hirsch, very important, and under Leo Beck, threatened somebody who was trying to get transports to Palestine, threatened with the Gestapo. That is, if you continue to do this and therefore block exit possibilities for German Jews, I will bring the German police to arrest you. The woman who was threatened, her name was Recha Freyer, she fled to Palestine, and after the war she wrote and wrote saying Leo Beck was no saint, and I hope one day they will take away his saint. But that was the beginning of it. The French consistoire, I know a lot about the French situation, of course, did everything, writing letter after letter to Pétain, saying, we are French for generations. Please, no statute for us. The foreign Jews have to. A historian as prominent like Marc Bloch, our hero in our field, wrote to the not the consistoire directly, but to a subcommittee of the consistoire. If you create what was the intention, an institute for Jewish studies, it should really represent all trends within French Jewry. As for the foreign Jews, they are really not part of us and should be pushed to emigrate. That's a letter from Marc Bloch. So, and it goes on terribly. But this is not so astonishing. This apparently, I said that the other day in Berkeley, and somebody mentioned, well, you know, if you look at Jewish history in the 19th century and so on, you find this constant hostility of one group to the other. This is a tradition, the leftist against the rightist, and in the Warsaw Ghetto, during the military the armed uprising of 43, the left-wing fighters did not want, and vice versa, coordinate their efforts with the right-wing revisionists who were fighting on the other side of the city. And that was already during the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now there is a little bit written about it. This is taboo. Taboo. This is discussed in Israel every day. But it is, and by writing a kind of history which looks at all aspects, you see it, because you deal with Jewry in every possible country, and you see this interaction. It's a very sad story between groups which, deported Jews from Berlin, let's say, to Lodz, would be considered with great suspicion by the Polish Jews. And I think that Rumkowski, the head of the Lodz ghetto, helped a little bit to put them on the list for Chełmno in May 1942. It's a sad story. There are some questions. Should I? It's your decision. I'm here to answer questions. That's fine with me, but maybe it's too much for the. You have to decide. Excuse me? One or two more. Yeah, sure.
I also thoroughly enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
Especially the way that you brought out the history of the perspective of the
Yeah.
I know that the Holocaust has been well documented, but hearing it spoken, there's something really unique to that. It gives me, hearing you talk about the incredulity of victims right before they're about to be sent to the camps is both stunning but also believable. I'm wondering, what do you think that the Holocaust did to Europe? Looking back 50 years, how is Europe not what it would have been? if the Holocaust hadn't happened. And what did the Holocaust do to Jewish identity looking back?
The second question is, of course, slightly easier than the first, because we know what the Jews of Europe, whoever remained, as you know, came into DP camps and so on. And then, surely Zionism got a boost from the catastrophe. And there is a lot of criticism today regarding the attitude of the Zionist leadership in Palestine during the events, because what Ben-Gurion was really thinking about all the time before the Biltmore conference and afterwards was who will remain to build the Jewish state. He said it in that one occasion. We will be with a possible state, but nobody to build it. That is, he didn't think really, well, he did probably, but he didn't express it. He was fixated, maybe rightly so, on the building of the state. It's true that at the time the Yishuv was a community of 400,000 to 500,000 people, and they couldn't have done much, except that Antek Zuckerman, the name may be known to you, he was one of the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto and survived it and lived in Israel afterwards in a kibbutz Lochamei Getaot. He said, had you sent 1,000 volunteers to help us, we wouldn't have known what to do with them. Had you sent 100, it would have been pointless. That not one came, except at the very end, right, the paratroopers, but that was the end of the war, gives me a bitterness. He expressed it then in Lanzmann's Shoah, the film. If you were to lick my heart, you would be poisoned. It left bitterness among the Jews of Europe, mainly those fighting or who were part of the Zionist movement and so on. They said, now, some of them, that they felt totally abandoned by their own. So what it did to the Jews was certainly give a boost to Zionism and so on. And also the international community. The UN decision of 1947 to divide Palestine was certainly helped by the sense of the Jews having been murdered and none of us in Europe and so on helped and so on. What would have, how Europe would have changed or not changed, I do not know. But there I must tell you a little story, if you bear with me, which in a very metaphorical way will answer an unanswerable question of what if. I did write in the volume, my first volume, about the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, in a very small town in West Germany called Wittlich. And I wrote what happened in Wittlich, that the synagogue was set fire and Jewish men were put on a truck to be brought to a camp, and Jewish women were standing there completely in despair and yelling. And the wife of the butcher, Mrs. Marx, was standing in the square of the town and yelling to the windows of her neighbors, "What did we do to you? Why do you do this to us?" Well, the neighbors were standing at the windows in total silence, of course. And that's what I wrote. And years later, at a conference, a young man comes and says, "I have a message for you." He says, "A message from my grandmother who lives in Wittlich." I said, "Wittlich? I remember what I wrote." He says, "Yes. My grandmother asked you to tell you this. After the Jews were deported from Wittlich for good, to the east, their belongings were shared among the inhabitants. One got bedding, another got a bed frame, another got a pillow, and so on." And he says, "Today, there are these pillows and these beddings in closets, and nobody knows what to do with it. To throw it away is impossible. To keep it, you keep it in your closet. Each time you open the closet, you see the pillow. And that is, in a way, a metaphor for the European situation. That explains this grip of memory which nobody engineers. It's simply, you know, this extraordinary extermination in the midst of highest level cultural nations and so on. I think you will have to decide now, because I see many hands, but